Hello and welcome. So in this tutorial, we're going to go and look at more intermediate audio features that are available in Premiere, and specifically using the essential sound settings, which is a simplification um, and kind of tailoring to the needed use of some of the effects and tools that are available in Adobe Audition. I meant Premiere. They're also available in Audition. Okay, so to start with, the video source I'm using in this tutorial is from the Prelinger archives, and it's basic. It's called Duck and Cover, and you can search for Prelinger archives. It's part of archive.org. These are public domain videos. I'm going to play it without the audio right now, but it's called Duck and Cover, and it is about trying to stay safe by hiding under your desk from an atomic bomb, which we all know works very, very effectively. Um, and so, and it also kind of equates like auto safety to the safe, like to a bomb being dangerous. It's pretty great. So what we're going to do first, and then this audio track, the sound, the music, is just a song that I've been working on. I'm using it not because it's shameless self-promotion, but because then I just didn't have to worry about copyright on music in a YouTube video. Made life a lot easier. And so you can download or pull in whatever music track you want. We're just using this first video for dialogue. And so one of the things to note is, and I've already done this in mine, if you were to pull this in, the clip, the initial, there's like the intro, there's some intro music, there's a turtle that's animated, and then basically it fades into this scene here, and that's where we're going to get started with the tutorial. Because then it's just pretty much dialogue. There's some sirens and stuff that come in, but there's no music. And so, yeah, so we just have dialogue. Okay, so let's listen to the dialogue real quick. So we're going to unmute this track.
That's why these children are practicing to duck and cover, just as you do in your school.
Yes, we all duck and cover. All right, so that's the dialogue, and then just to hear the music, here we go. Right, nice kind of chill house track. It's kind of an odd combo, but whatever, it works. Okay, so in editing mode, and the way that in the previous tutorial I showed you how to edit video, right, we were basically creating keyframes and adjusting the amplitude of the waveform. And I might have talked a little bit about panning as well, which is, right, essentially saying, should this go in the right channel, the right audio channel, or the left audio channel? So that separation can be really helpful sometimes as well, in order for things to stand out from one another. In our case, I want this dialogue, right? It's a voiceover. I want it to be centered. It's going to just stay in the center, and I want the music to be centered as well. So we're not going to do any of that. And I don't have any fade in or fade outs on this because I really just want to focus on the raw audio sounds. Now, one of the issues is, right, if I'm playing this, and I don't have them both muted, what I want you to look at is over here, we're going to get some what's called clipping.
So ready for many other dangers that are around us all.
Right. So whenever your audio levels go up to the point where they clip and you get these red marks that stay up there, that basically is an indication that you have run out of headroom. And headroom is basically some open space above where you basically have room for any loud spikes in sound to exist up there without hitting the actual top limit of what what the audio codec can actually handle, right? There's a certain, everything in computers is, right, a range of numbers. And so sound, it really depends, but we'll just say it's a range. Let's say it was a range of numbers from 0 to 8, right? It was like really 1-bit sound, right? It's basically if the signal gets too loud, then it's going to be like, oh, it needs to be a 9 or a 10 or an 11 or a 12, but that doesn't exist. And so it's just going to say, well, it's 8. And when it does that, you get what's called clipping, and you start to have distortion in your audio. You may have heard this anytime somebody's like recorded a mic too loud or gotten really close to a mic, and you hear that kind of poppy, crackly stuff that happens. That's what we're talking about, and that's what we're trying to have not happen. And so Audition has some things that make it really easy, and they have some default settings that help us get the levels of the music and the vocals right, in the sense that they're like standards in terms of like how loud they need to be for us to be able to hear everything clearly. So, and we're going to start from there, and then we're going to go a little further. So first we're going to go and change our workspace, because just having this one level meter is not really going to help us. So we're going to go down to audio. And when we do this, right, the window changes, the video is much smaller. We have this pane here that has this audio track mixer brought up. And I want you to note there are two different mixers available in here. The first one is the audio clip mixer, which you'll see is just the clips that we've got in here, right? If I select one of these or select one of these, those are our clips, and these are the individual clips that we're mixing, right? We only have 3, you'll notice, but if we go to the audio track, that's the entire track, right? That's the whole. If we had other clips of dialogue, or if I had chopped this up some, this is doing levels for the entire track, not just the clip, right? So we've been working on clips. This is, again, it's the entire audio track. And it will apply whatever we're doing to that track. So the first thing we want to do in this case, make sure everything's set to 0. This is like the 4th time I've attempted to to do this tutorial. So because of audio issues, oddly enough. And so I had things set there, but make sure all your levels are set to 0 to start with. And then we're going to select the dialogue track first. And you'll note when I have either one of these selected, there's this essential sound pane over here, and there's a few options, right? One of the really nice things about how Premiere has started to do this is you basically are tagging your audio clips as a certain type. So you can say, oh, these are all dialogue. This is all music, even though they're different songs, right? You can tag them, and then that makes it a lot easier, because it opens up different tools to you that are more relevant to what you're working on. So if I click on dialogue, right? So now I've got this dialogue set. There's presets up here. We're not going to worry about any of those, but you'll see that there's this option for repair, clarity, and creative. Now, I'm going to probably have to, no, those are all pretty much actually where they're supposed to be. Okay, I just want to make sure I hadn't messed anything up. And so the first thing we're going to do is loudness, right? And so you'll see it tells you what it does. It automatically matches the clip to standard average loudness for dialogue. And so I'm going to go ahead and hit OK, or hit auto match. It basically analyzes it, and you'll notice that the audio waveform shrinks kind of pretty substantially, right? So I'm going to go to music, the music track, which is here. I'm going to go ahead and do the same thing, except I'm going to click on music instead of dialogue, and I'm going to click auto match again for loudness. If loudness isn't open, go ahead and you just click on it, it'll pop open, and then you can auto match it. And you'll see that each one of these is slightly different, and we don't need to really worry about what LUFS is, but it is like it's the way loudness is currently measured. There's much better tutorials about this. There's, if you search for Fab Filter, loudness, Dan Morwall, you'll get a really great understanding of what that is and what that means and why it's important at this point. Okay, so you will notice, right, there are different options here. There's duration and ducking, whereas if I click on my dialogue, I have other options. So now if I go ahead and play this, you're going to see that already we're no longer peaking, but the audio is going to be substantially quieter too.
All the time. Fire is a danger. It can burn whole buildings if someone is careless. But we are ready for fire.
And so I'd like you to pay attention to the gray numbers that pop up here. What those do is they basically for whatever, I don't know how long their like window of analysis is, but it basically, anytime there's like a new peak that's a certain height, it'll like kind of update it and tell you, hey, this is the highest level that your audio hit. So
we have a fine fire department to put out the fire. And you have fire.
You can
drills
see
in
that
your
it's
school,
like
so
negative
you'll know
9
what to do.
decibels is about where we're at right now.
Automobiles can be dangerous.
I'm going to go ahead and jump forward to a louder part of the track. You can see where the music kind of creeps up a little bit here. And so we'll go ahead and play this.
If you are not ready, did not know what to do, it could hurt you in different.
Okay, so really it's peaking at about -8. That's going to be a little bit too quiet for what we want in the end, but it's a good place to start. So let's go ahead and select our dialogue, and we're going to go ahead and mute the music because we want to look at what some of these options do. We have repair, clarity, and creative. We're going to start with repair, and repair, surprisingly enough, repairs audio. And what that means is, right, if there's noise in the audio, if there's some low rumbly sounds that could be from somebody talking too close to a mic and all that air hitting the mic and creating like a lower, deeper sound, they're called plosives. Or it could be from like, wind noise, or maybe there's a train rolling past and you're trying to just get rid of some of that rumble because that can make the rest of your sound muddy, is the word that typically gets used to describe that. And then de-hum. We're not going to be using de-hum. We'll listen to this and we'll fix some things. But de-hum, basically, there's electricity in our walls is either oscillating at 60 times a second or 60 hertz. So it creates a low hum, or it's doing it at 50 hertz. And that just depends on where you are in the world. In the US, all of our electricity runs at 60 hertz. In other places, it runs at 50 hertz. And so if there's certain situations where, depending on how you have things attached and connected and grounded and all of that, sometimes you'll hear this like low, just constant hum in your audio. And this is to get rid of that. DS. So surprisingly enough, de-essing is meant to get rid of those hissing high sh sounds and F sounds as well. Like if you have a f sound, right? It's going to soften those, and it doesn't really eliminate them completely, but those sounds can be really distracting, and they tend to be like a peak because our ears are more sensitive to sounds, between 2000 and like 5000 hertz or something. And that's where a lot of that is. And so it basically rounds that off and quiets that down a little bit. And so that's what a de-esser does. It's a bit more complex than that, but that's generally what's happening. And then reduce reverb. Reverb is, right, you've all been in churches or big spaces or tiny spaces or bathrooms or whatever, and and things sound different because of reverb. Reverb is basically the sound coming from whatever source. Let's say it's your voice, and it's caused by the difference in time from that sound going from it's the source to your ear, and from the source to a wall and back to your ear, or a floor or a ceiling or whatever reflective surface. And so, with a microphone, you get reverb as well. And you may be able to hear it in my voice right now, but right, it's all those reflections coming back and being recorded slightly after, or if you're in a really big space, a long time after your actual like voice is reaching the microphone. And so there's like algorithms and stuff that will help reduce that. And so let's go ahead, and we're going to we don't need rumble, but I'm going to turn it on at some point so you can hear what it does to his voice. But so we're going to start with noise. And so I'm going to go ahead and turn up the volume on on audio track 1. We're going to turn this back down at some point, but I just want to make sure it's loud enough so you can really hear the noise.
Different ways. It could knock you down hard or throw you against a tree.
Okay, so can you kind of hear that hiss and pop in the background? So I'm going to go ahead and turn reduce noise on, and we'll hear the difference. So I'm going to play it with some noise first and then turn it on.
Or a wall. It is such a big explosion, it can smash in buildings and knock signboards over and break windows all over town. But
Okay, so you can hear it takes away a little bit of the fullness of his voice, but it also really gets rid of that noise now, and it's much more clear. Now, sometimes you might want that noise. You're like, oh, this is an old recording. I want that noise in there. That's great. You don't need to reduce the noise at all in that case. But sometimes it's distracting and unnecessary. So we're going to leave the noise reduction on, and we're going to leave it at 5. You can experiment and crank it up and see what it sounds like. It's like it does such a good job right in the middle for this audio track that I'm going to leave it there. So again, we're going to do rumble, right? And so with rumble, again, it's going to make his voice sound thinner because he has a slightly deeper voice, even though, right, there's a lot of high end in the recording. And so if I go ahead and turn on rumble reduction, let's listen.
If you duck and cover like Bert,
you don't hear much difference there.
You know how bad sunburn can feel. The atomic bomb flash could burn you worse than a terrible sunburn, especially where...
So it's subtle, but you can probably hear just like a little bit more depth in his voice with reduced rumble turned off. And so since there is no rumble, we're going to leave that off. Again, de-hum, nothing bad is happening at 60 hertz. We're going to leave that off. But let's go ahead and look at the de-esser. And so the de-esser...
We'll know when it comes. We hope it never comes, but we must get ready. It looks something like this. There's a bright flash, brighter than the sun, brighter than anything you've ever seen. If you were not ready and did not know what to do, it could hurt you in different ways.
So it's, again, this is subtle. And honestly, in this recording, I'm pretty sure that, you know, they used an analog de-esser if they had something like that, or they did some little bit of manipulation to this recording when they made it, so that it would not have such strong S's, or he was a good distance from the microphone when he was talking. But I want you to listen, if I crank it up, it makes him sound a little bit like he's kind of underwater.
It could knock you down hard or throw you against a tree or a wall. It is such a big explosion, it can smash in buildings and knock signboards over.
It's subtle, but
break windows.
It's subtle, but it's there, right? And so we can leave DS on at about 5. That's a really minor thing. And then let's go ahead and look at reducing reverb. So you may not even hear much. You may not even hear much reverb in this audio now, but let's go ahead and see what happens when we reduce it.
Town, but if you duck and cover like Bert, you will be much safer. You know how bad sunburn can feel.
Can you hear that? It makes it sound like his voice. You can, if you listen really closely, you can hear like a slight doubling of his voice, right? There isn't a whole lot of reverb in this audio. I'm going to go ahead and crank this up and we'll hear what happens, because it does start to introduce some weirdness as you crank the setting up on this.
The atomic bomb flash could burn you worse than a terrible sunburn, especially where you're not covered. Now, you and I don't have shells to crawl into like Bert the Turtle, so...
Okay, so hopefully we're not crawling into our shells. So the reduced reverb, right, you can see that when you crank it up, it can have more of an impact. But right around the middle, again, this default setting works pretty well for this track. All right, so let's close this, repair up, and let's open Clarity. So what Clarity does is it has a couple options here. One is dynamics, and you'll see it talks about expressing or expanding the dynamic range of a recording. If you don't know what that means, basically the dynamic range is how loud is the loudest sound and how quiet is the quietest sound. And the dynamic range is the difference between those values, right? And so like classical music tends to have a really big dynamic range, right? There's very, very quiet parts that then crescendo into these huge, like, you know, epic parts as well. And so there's a huge dynamic range for that. Certain music has a much smaller dynamic range. Spoken word can have a huge dynamic range too, right? People could be whispering, they could be shouting. And so in this case, his dynamic range is not huge, right? He's talking at about the same distance from the microphone, and he's, you know, not monotone, but he's, you know, he's only so excited about this topic. So What dynamics does is it either compresses or expands that range. And when it compresses it, and it actually does two steps when we do this slider. First, when you compress that audio, what it's doing is it's bringing the loudest parts down, it's making those quieter, and it's making the quietest parts louder. And so that's one step. And then the second step that this tool does is it then also lifts that entire range up higher. So it's all louder. It's almost like it's keeping the top at the top of the range and it's just pulling the bottom up. Whereas most compressors work by compressing down from the top and bottom. And then you have a different value that you adjust to push that loudness back up. And expansion does the opposite. So we'll listen to this. So focused and natural is like absolutely no compression whatsoever. And focused is a lot of compression. So we're going to listen to how that slider changes things. So this is with no compression.
We have to cover up in our own way. First, you duck, and then you cover.
Right. So you can already hear it sounds a little louder and more clear. So I'm going to crank this up so we can hear the difference.
And very tightly, you cover the back of your neck, your face. Duck and cover underneath a table.
And so then I actually, peaked. I hit some, I clipped out there a little bit, right? But so you can see this can add a lot of loudness. And what's nice about it is that it doesn't just add loudness, but it compresses that range. So even the quietest sounds become louder. And it's not like when you adjust the volume and you just make everything the same amount loudness, you're actually doing a little bit more nuanced loudening. I don't know if that's a word, of the audio. So I'm going to leave this wherever it was. It was somewhere around here. It's like just enough of a boost that it brings it up and makes it more clear, but it's not going to, push it up to the limit. And also, I do have this boosted already. So that's why we're redlining at this point. Okay, so we've got dynamics. So then EQ. This is just, usually with EQ, you have you have a whole bunch of sliders and you can adjust the loudness of all these different frequency bands manually. In Essential Sound, it just gives you a few presets and they have some use. But so let's go ahead and start playing the audio. We're going to start by playing the bass audio and then we're going to check mark EQ and listen to this preset that's just background voice.
Or desk or anything else close by. In Betty's school, they're talking about the atomic bomb too. Betty is asking her teacher, how can we tell when the atomic bomb...
Right, so you can see as I crank this setting up, it actually does sound like he's going a little bit further back.
...may explode. And her teacher is explaining that there are two kinds of attack.
Right, and basically what this bar here represents is this is like 20 hertz down here. This is 20,000 or more hertz up here. And this is just showing that it's dipping this. It's making these frequency ranges a little bit quieter. So let's go and look at some of these other options. So there's like intercom, locked in a trunk. We'll look at those two, and then we'll look at some that are tend to be more useful. But let's go to intercom, and I'm going to crank that and mount down just a touch, but here we go.
With warning and without any warning. We think that most of the time we will be warned before the bomb explodes.
Right, so this is doing the opposite. It's bringing up these higher frequency values, and it's dropping and eliminating all the low end below a certain point. If we do locked in the trunk, it's kind of the opposite. And I'm going to go ahead and play that.
Explodes. So there will be time for us to get into our homes, schools.
Right, so it sounds like it's way in the back and kind of locked in a trunk. Now, the ones that are going to be more useful are these subtle boost, high tone, low tone, and vocal presence. So you could experiment with all of these. I'm going to go ahead and say vocal presence is what I'm looking for, because what we're trying to do is we really want, the dialogue to stand out on top of the music. And so if I go ahead and I'm going to start somewhere in the middle with this and hit play.
Or some other safe place. Our civil defense workers and our men in uniform will do everything they can to warn us before enemy planes.
Now, because I'm trying to show these individual settings on their own, I don't have the background audio playing or the music playing. And so usually what you would do is you would have the music playing as well, and you'd be adjusting these settings until you were happy with how it sounded against the music, right? In our case, we're just going to go for it like this because I really want you to hear what you're doing without that background music in there. Okay, so the last option here is enhanced speech. We'll go ahead and pull this playhead back a bit so we don't get to the sirens that are in the audio at some point here later. And we're going to go ahead and
Burn you worse than a terrible sunburn, especially where you're not covered. Now, you and I don't have shells to crawl into like Bert the Turtle, so...
Let's try it. That was high tone. You can hear that it really brought the higher end of his vocal range out. We're going to go ahead and turn this on, and we're going to do low tone now.
We have to cover up in our own way. First, you duck, and then you cover. And very tightly, you cover the back of your neck and your face.
I'm actually hearing very little variation there. But his voice is lower as it's a masculine voice. And so setting that to low tone is probably what we want to do. However, you may, when you're playing the music in the background, you may be like, oh no, high tone actually makes his voice stand up on top of that music a little bit better. But we're going to go ahead and leave it like that. And so now we've set everything we need to set for fixing this audio and for making it more clear. Now we need to, now Creative only has one option, which is reverb, right? So we've got taken away reverb. Now we can add it back in a controlled way. This can be good if you say you have a character that you've mic'd, and that character is walking through a space, and so the mic isn't going to be catching all the reverb, or maybe it's like useless reverb, but maybe it's an animated thing, and you want a person to go from being in a small space to being in a huge cavernous space. This is how you can add that cavernous feeling. So if I go ahead and play this as it stands.
Duck and cover underneath a table or desk or anything else close by. In Betty's school, they're talking about the atomic bomb, too. Betty is asking the teacher, how can we tell when the atomic bomb may explode? And her teacher is explaining that...
Okay, and then, so that's pretty obvious. There's other options here. Thicken voice, these warm room, warm voice, these things basically allow you to have like, they're much smaller, right? The bigger the space, the more, right, the longer that reverb sounds. And then this slider, what it does is it basically says, right, no reverb. And what it is right here, it's like 50% of your original audio and 50% of the reverb signal. But if you crank it all the way up here, your original audio signal is gone, and it's just the reverb that you're listening to. So
there are two kinds of attack, with warning and without.
Right, so at that high end, you're just hearing the reflections. You're not hearing the base audio. You're just hearing what's been processed. So usually with reverb, again, you want to be playing this with whatever your other audio source is, and you adjust it. Some people say you should just not be able to hear it, hear that it's there. It really depends on what you're working on. Obviously, if there's like a major echo in an echoey space, you're going to want to hear that. But again, you try and make it as subtle as possible to start. So I'm going to not use auditorium. Let's just say we want to thicken his voice.
Warning. We think that most of the time we will be warned before the bomb explodes. So there will be time for us to get into our homes, schools, or some other safe place. Our civil defense workers and our men in uniform will do...
Right, so I've just barely done a little bit here, and that's what it does is it makes the voice seem more pronounced and have more presence, but it doesn't distract or add too much noise to reduce our clarity again. Okay, so that's dialogue. Yay, we've done it. Let's go ahead and look at music real quick, and then we will talk about the last step, which is going to be adding what's called a limiter and doing our final adjustments. So in this clip, we've auto matched. There's two options here that we have. We have duration and ducking. So duration, if we're using that, basically what that does is it allows us to stretch our audio track in a couple of different ways. And so if I turn this on, and right, say the target duration is this. I don't know what my current duration on this audio track is, but we're going to see if this turn does anything right now. So let's go ahead and play this. Now, I think that's the same duration that we've got. Basically, what this does is you want to, this is basically to adjust the length of a song. And I haven't actually looked these up because it's something that I would probably do in a different program. But what it allows you to do is either basically stretch the length of the song without changing the pitch so it sounds the same, or intentionally making it deeper, like have a deeper pitch if you stretch it, or it's higher pitched if you push it together a little bit, if you make it shorter. And so this allows you like a cleaner way of doing that. Yeah, sometimes you have a track and you're like, ooh, that beat is a little bit too fast for this scene. Maybe I need to slow it down. Or you're like, the audio track ends a couple seconds before the video, before the shot ends, and I really need to stretch this out a touch. And that's what this tool is for. So we're not going to deal with that too much right now. There, again, people have other tutorials on that. You can search if you need it. Ducking is the last thing. And ducking, in our case, it's not going to do anything, because the dialogue is so thick, there's so much of it, and there's so little space that it doesn't really make sense. But what we're going to do is, so if I click generate keyframes now with the default settings, it's going to not generate any keyframes whatsoever, because the audio, right, we've already done a fair amount of work in terms of getting things to stand out from each other, and it's just not going to do anything. So I'm going to shrink some of this so we can see, like I'm going to adjust some of these settings so we can see what this looks like. I'm just basically going to set the sensitivity higher, then the fade position will stay the same, and fade duration I'm going to make shorter. Note you can duck against any of these things, and what ducking is it basically quiets the music track while the dialogue is going, and then it will allow it to be louder when there's no dialogue. And so if there's big gaps in dialogue, then this is something that this tool could be pretty useful. In our case, because they're overlapping continuously, it just makes it sound weird. So I'm going to go ahead and generate some keyframes. That'll take a second, and we'll see what this looks like. And so what it's actually doing to our audio file, or to, okay, so you can see there are keyframes down here on audio track 2. If I zoom in on the timeline, you'll see that these keyframes are aligned with where there are gaps in audio, in dialogue. Now, if I play this, you're going to hear how weird it sounds. Right? So that's not something that we really want to do in this case. It doesn't really make any sense. But again, if you did it more subtly, 18 decibels is a pretty massive change. And so we don't, right, that's not really helpful. And the fade in and fade out is weird. There's a lot of things that are going wrong with this. So in our case, this isn't a useful tool, but I want you to know that it's there. I'm going to go ahead and undo this. And I'm going to turn ducking off so we don't have to worry about that. We don't need to worry about duration. We're just focused on this loudness. Okay. So those are our options here. So I'm going to go ahead and reset the dialogue to 0 here, right? Because I cranked it up so you could hear that noise more clearly. And so I've got these 2 tracks. One is muted, so let's go ahead and turn this back on.
Than the sun, brighter than anything you've ever seen. If you are not ready, did not know what to do.
Right. So I would say in this case, right, the vocal track is very clear. The music seems too quiet to me. So one of the things that I want to do is I want to I'd like to make the music louder. But instead of making the music louder at this point, what I want to do to make sure I give myself as much headroom as possible for the next step is I actually want to do the inverse. I want to make the vocal track quieter, right? I want to be 0 should be the top of whatever of each one of these things for now. And so instead of raising this up, and that's something you could do, you could raise the volume of the music up and then say, oh, it's like 5 decibels up. So then I'm going to set that to 0 and set the audio 1 to -5. Or I can just pull this down until it sounds more even. So let's go ahead and try that.
It could hurt you in different ways. It could knock you down hard or throw you against a tree or a wall. It is such a big explosion, it can smash in buildings and knock signboards over and break windows all over town.
Right, so I can still pretty clearly hear the dialogue on top of the music. And so that means that -4 is pretty good. Okay, so we've done that. So now what's the next step? We want this all to be louder, right? Because that's pretty quiet. And one of the things is that in different audio codecs like MP3, AAC, some of those have a top threshold where if you go above that threshold, there's going to be distortion. And it's not even on every device that plays an MP3. Some things like computers and stuff account for some of those things. And I've got certain audio tracks that I mixed to 0 decibels. And they sound fine on my computer, but then I have this kind of crappy MP3 player. I put them on there and they all sound really distorted and kind of awful when they at certain points in the tracks. And so so one thing we need to do is, for compressed audio formats, it's usually good to cap your absolute maximum at -1 decibels. Now, I could crank this up until I get there, but basically what's going to happen is there's always a chance that there's going to be a spike in that audio that's going to push into the clipping range. What would be nice is if I could kind of round off those really loud spikes while allowing the rest of the audio to essentially be louder, right? Because then if those errant spikes weren't there, I could actually pull everything up and make the whole thing a little bit louder. And that's what something called a hard limiter allows us to do. So what we're going to do is we're going to come over here. There's this little tiny arrow on the side here that's sneaky. We're going to flip this down. And what this opens up is it opens up what's called the effects rack and the sends for these different audio tracks. We're not going to be worried about sending or putting any effects on any of our tracks here. We're just looking at the mix. And all we want to do is we want to add a hard limiter. So if I click on this little drop-down arrow here and effects slot 1, you'll see all of these things. You may note that some of the names in here look a lot like the tools that we've been talking about in Essential Sound, and they're right. Those tools in Essential Sound are using these tools. These are also all the same things that are available in Adobe Audition. So I'm going to say amplitude and compression. I'm going to come over here, and what I want is a hard limiter. Now, this hard limiter, this little knob thing is super obnoxious to use. I don't know why it's even there. So what we're going to do is we're going to double click on the word hard limiter, and that's going to open up this little editor, right? And so now what I can do is I'm going to zoom out on my audio track just a little bit. Maybe. There we go. And I'm going to look for an area that's pretty loud, right? There's this area here where the music, kind of crescendos and gets pretty loud. So I'm going to start here because this is one of the loudest parts in the song. And what these different settings up here do is, one, this turns it on or off. We're going to leave it on, obviously. Peak or true peak, they work slightly different. We're not going to worry too much about that right now. We're just going to leave it at peak. But there's this maximum amplitude and then the input boost, look ahead, and release time. The look ahead and release time settings for what we're working on are pretty good as they are. It's a good default. There are a bunch of presets for this as well. You could go through and test those and see how it sounds. But to start with, I'm going to set this to -1 instead of -1/10. So I'm going to say -1.0. And then we're going to go ahead and play this now, and then we're going to work with this input boost.
First safe place fast. Always remember, the flash of an atomic bomb can come at any time, no matter where you may be. You might be out playing at home when the warning comes. Then
and so what I want you to note as I'm continuing to play this is when it gets to -1, right? It never gets above -1. It stays at -1. And what you don't want to do is you don't want to press this up so it's just -1 all the time, right? Because that's really going to shrink your dynamic range and make the audio sound really kind of flat and not okay. What you want to do is you want that limiter to be engaging sometimes, but not all the time. And so I've like 9.4, I might try 10 decibels and see what that looks like. And then maybe work back down from there.
Sure to get into the house fast, where your parents have fixed a safe place for you to go.
Right, so you can see that that is staying at -1 for far more time than it was at 9.4. So I might go back down to 9.4 decibels of boost.
If you are not close to home when you hear the warning, go to the nearest safe cover.
And even that, it's up there quite a while, so maybe we'll just say 9. I think that should probably be a good boost for our signal.
Know where you are to go, or ask an older person to help you. You know the places marked with the S sign? They're safe places to go when you hear the alarm.
Right, so now it's it's less frequently getting to that place. So this is probably a really good setting. So now we have got an audio file, or we've got our audio in the best possible state to then send to a streaming platform, right? This is how we want things to work. So let's go ahead and I'm going to export this audio really quickly so that we can look at what that looks like in terms of the waveform. So I'm going to go to export, and I already had this set previously, but you would just go to format. You could go to AAC audio or MP3 or whatever, but AAC audio is fine. Once I do that, you just want to make sure you choose your thing. I'm going to say this is not sequence 1. We'll just call this test audio export. And I'm just going to export it. I'm not going to go to media encode. I'm just going to export it through here. It doesn't take very long to export this. And now I'm going to import it so we can look at the waveform. And I'll scroll down. There it is. I'm going to double click. Right. And so you can see, right, it gets a lot quieter over here because, right, the music stops. But when the music's there, you'll see, and it's hard to see on their meter. Maybe I can pull this down and get more stuff. But you'll see, right, we have all these peaks, and you can see there's only a few that really hit that top limit, and everything else is inside. So we have good dynamic range, good loudness, and we have something that's going to sound pretty great when we export it, when we upload it or do whatever we're going to do with this.
That's why these children.
All right, so thank you for listening, and yeah, have a good day.
Are practicing to duck and cover just as you do in your school. We all know the atomic bomb is very dangerous. Since it may be used against us, we must get ready for it, just as we are ready for many other dangers that are around us all.